Thank you, everyone, for those wonderful presentations. I'll invite all of the panelists to come back on video. We have several questions for each of you. And I will ask that after listening to all of the talks, and there were a couple of questions in the chat, specifically about diversity. And I think that those comments really kind of cut across all of your presentations. So I thought I'd start with that question and like, how is diversity defined and how does that impact the thought process in what we do? And we know that diversity can be defined differently depending on the type of work that you're doing or across different areas of not just the US, but then also global diversity. When you have studies that are focused on global recruitment or global studies on the same topic. So maybe a few of you could kind of chime in on how do you define diversity, and then how do you communicate that definition of diversity, or do you need to communicate that definition of diversity in your work?
Oh, who wants to go first? Karen, I think you're probably the expert on the call, but as I said in the chat, I think there's the broad definition of diversity, and there's also the issue of inclusion. So broadly speaking, certainly diversity expands well beyond race. And what I was speaking to is the need for a U.S. need to include more Black and Brown people in our clinical trials, because we have an absence of evidence in terms of the overall safety and efficacy in those patient populations. And we're continuing to see very, very low numbers until sponsors are held to account to actually increase the numbers. And we've seen that those efforts are successful, with the latest success being viewed in the clinical trials for the COVID vaccine. We can do this. We also have, I can speak as a global drug developer, we have a need to look at diverse patient populations around the whole globe. And that's a need that we deal with those individual regulators. And certainly we have had cases where the African experience can be complemented by enrolling patients in Africa and not exclusively in the US. But I think the focus today that is important is to look at, for the US, it's to be more inclusive of Black, Brown, and Asian, with a lesser degree for Asian, because they're in a better state with regard to inclusion in clinical trials than our Black and Brown citizens. So Karen, I don't know if you have something to add to that.
Yeah. I needed for you to go first because I needed to formulate my thoughts. These kinds of questions oftentimes I have a visceral response, because sometimes people who kind of smack down diversity or are trying to say, well, shouldn't we just be, open for all? Yes, but we're not. And so we know that. So my definition for diversity is, again, going to be specific to the US, because we need to take care of folks at home. And, people talk about global health, and the United States is part of global health. So that's what my lens is going to be. And we know that from a genetic standpoint, that there's not much variance between different populations. And so when I talk about race, I'm using race, as we know, it's a social construct. So I took out a slide in my slide deck that actually talked about nature versus nurture, right? Are there biologic differences? Are there genetic differences? Or is it really just the social structure, right? And for eons, we know that in the United States, it's been proposed that Blacks are just have poor genetics, that it's all just a biologic thing. And we know that's not the case. I talked about multiple myeloma in my clinic, in my talk. We know, and there's data to show, that if Blacks are enrolled in clinical trials, they oftentimes have the same outcomes, and sometimes even better, than other racial and ethnic groups. But the challenge is, number one, we know also from the data that they oftentimes don't even get the same standard of care that we know works in other populations. And so I would like for this conversation to really be focused on what are the needs. And you know, the NIH has defined diversity in a certain way, and I think that helps to provide a framework for how we do clinical trials. And do I agree that everyone needs to be included? Yes, I do. I talked about, you know, geographic differences and individuals from lower socioeconomic status. I could have talked about LGBTQ plus communities, which we know that they are oftentimes disenfranchised and, you know, not included. We don't even ask the question about, you know, sexual orientation and gender identity, right, when it comes to some of these things. So we have a lot of work to do, but we know that there have been massive gaps for Black and brown communities, as you said. Our American Indian populations are always excluded. We've got to do a better job at saying, okay, we know what populations are underserved in this country. How do we create an inclusive framework?
I'd like to echo that, if I may. I love the way you described it, Karen. I think when we think about diversity, there are so many factors, including the issues you alluded to with socioeconomic factors that can impact each race or gender identity across the spectrum, because we're all subject to, you know, access to care issues. But you know, some populations more disproportionately so. So we have to be more aware, more educated as to where those gaps are. And we have to go the extra mile, both in access to care, but also in access to clinical trials. The FDA has issued guidance around that. Studies have shown that there are simple factors that can enable, you know, taking off time from work if you have a job that's not as flexible, transportation costs, follow-up to make sure that, you know, a patient can be compliant in a clinical trial. So it's not just can we enroll them, but can we maintain their enrollment in the trial and then beyond. So there's so many factors and so many things that we need to do better. And that really, that's the only, and we know that these diseases massively disproportionately affect underserved populations. So absolutely, we have to do better, and you can't manage what you can't measure. So we have to agree on definitions, we have to agree on the gaps, and then we have to act all along the way from clinical trials to clinical care.
And Grace, can I just add one more thing, because you've said that so nicely as well, that there have been studies that have proven that if you actually focus on the most disenfranchised population, it actually improves the outcomes for everybody in that group. So again, we know that these huge gaps exist for certain populations. And I do think that if we're thoughtful about how to be inclusive of those most underserved populations, we will indeed see that there is an improvement in terms of creating a more inclusive environment for everyone.
And Karen, another question for you, and others may have a comment on this as well. It's about how might meaningful community partnerships be built. And one thought that I had during your presentation when you were talking about your community engagement toolkit, which I think is a fabulous resource, but as a basic scientist or someone who's in the drug development field, how can they go about using this toolkit or other resources to build the trust that is necessary in order to implement something like that toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think, you know, those community engagement studios have been very successful because the institution had made it their business to be engaged in the community, right? So I think from a standpoint of larger institutions and drug development companies, like, have a patient advisory council if you don't have one. That's a very easy first step. We see cancer centers are doing it, some of which are doing it because they were forced to, because the National Cancer Institute said that if you want comprehensive status, you need to, you know, have a community engaged approach. But I think similarly, companies can say, we value the patient voice, we value what you bring to the table. And it could simply start with advocacy groups. You know, if you're dealing with patients with MS, reach out to MS Society, right? Or sickle cell. There are advocacy groups that would love to partner with large pharmaceutical companies and drug developers to say, how do we make sure that the patient voice is heard?
I Actually, one point about patient advocacy groups, because in various contexts over the years, I've worked with different ones, even the patient advocacy groups need to be more mindful of inclusion, because they need to make sure they represent the entire population, whether it's a cardiovascular advocacy group, respiratory, cancer. They many times have the tools and the wherewithal to spend time on patient advocacy, and they may not always be thinking about or be as inclusive as they could be in serving the entire population. And they do fantastic work. It's nothing against patient advocacy groups, but I think it's just a reminder that every stakeholder involved needs to be mindful of these issues.
Yeah. Michelle, some of the things that you talked about is studies of different types of tools that can be used to collect data. And I wonder if there have been analyses on the acceptabilities of these tools across backgrounds. And I think, Beth, you probably talked about a little bit of this too, with like Wi-Fi and data access, and across different areas, and how that impacts getting the data back and the usability of the data, usability of the device. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, that might be more Grace's field, but I think that Beth shared the Apple Watch and the AFib and EKGs. I remember being at a big data conference at Stanford, and at the dinner, one of the Stanford professors talked about different devices, not only the Apple Watch, but other devices in terms of collecting heart rate, EKGs, et cetera. And they took it into the lab, and there was tremendous variability. And at that time, I think that the Apple Watch had the greatest variability of all the devices tested. And while Apple hadn't been willing to take the calls before the publication was set to be published, you can bet they took the call the day that he let them know that the publication was going into the press. And I'm pretty sure that Apple has done more modifications so that their algorithm has substantially improved. But there's one thing I think that we all need to consider, is that we all have these tools that there is regulatory oversight for use in the consumer space that's different than regulatory oversight for use in the endpoint space. And as Beth so nicely put, there's quite a bit of validation that needs to be put in place and built. And that stride velocity monitor has been validated with the European regulators, but we're still in partnership with other regulators around the world. So it's not just any one regulator there. It has to go through very rigorous review by several regulators for that endpoint to reach the high bar of validity that basically says we know that we are measuring truth through this digital device. And so for those of you that are in the tech space that are joining this and starting to throw your intellect into taking technology into the clinical trial space, welcome, because you've just entered a different world, and you won't be able to do releases like you did in the technology space. There will be a lot of clinical trial evidence that you'll have to bring to bear to actually prove that with a certain degree of specificity and sensitivity that you are measuring what you purport to measure. And that is not an easy or an inexpensive task, but really important, because we know that it can be done. And it's important that many of us that are in this space venture into this space. We are drug developers. We're not endpoint developers. And that we're not always endpoint developers, but sometimes we need to be endpoint developers to move the needle. So Grace, I gave you a little bit of time to think there. Here's something else to add.
That's exactly right. And I think you hit the nail on the head when we look at the differentiation between consumer applications and clinical applications. So obviously, and I'm sure Beth will comment on this, there's a whole other level of rigor for diagnostic clearance and for a specific medical indication. And part of the challenge is this is the Wild West with wearables, implantables, portables. Obviously, implantables have a higher degree, but even the portables and wearables, and then even software that you download to your phone and use the PPG technology. it's all over the place. And so eventually what you would hope is you would have this diagnostic clearance that can then be applied. But then what is the clinical utility? What you probably, Michelle, you're probably talking about the Mintu Turakia's work at Stanford with the Apple Heart Study, where they enrolled 400,000 patients in 6 months. It was amazing. But the issue there is, what do you do with all that data? When we talk to EPs, they're being bombarded with data from these devices with patients who are concerned. And so then you run into this whole issue of what's the right area of focus? How do you use these technologies actually for something that you can do something about? And so I think hopefully one day we'll get to the point where for a lot of these chronic diseases we've been talking about, there will be, these essentially will be commoditized, the same way a glucose measurement or an A1C measurement. You have something that's been rigorously validated, it's been used in clinical trials, and even from a consumer standpoint, if a patient, for example, has choices of things they can do at home and they have a diagnostic clear device that's part of the treatment paradigm, that's where we want to get to. But in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of money thrown. You referred to tech investors. Rock Health has issued a report of billions of dollars going into digital health the last few years. Don't even get me started on that, because most of those companies have failed because they're not thinking of the bigger picture of how to integrate it into a clinically useful and reimbursable paradigm. And that's the problem. So I think we need to be all very careful about how we'll be using these technologies, the quality of the data that is needed, and then how that data will be used, whether it's an immediate action that the patient can take or the provider can take, or whether it's a collection of data. I love what you guys were talking about, and Beth was talking about the future of being able to get to better endpoints. I mean, 6-minute walk distance is so notoriously just suboptimal for so many reasons. If we can get to a better version of that for all these indications of what it's used, that would be terrific. But we have to approach these things carefully and with rigor and recognize the difference between consumer applications, because everybody's more conscious of their health. They want to know these things, to the really, truly clinical applications.
Beth, did you have a comment on that as well?
I think Grace and Michelle did a great job. I really don't have much to add. We've talked a little bit about the volume of data, and I can honestly say I don't know how you would process that much data. If you have 30,000 patients in a clinical trial and they're wearing any kind of wearable for 24 hours a day for 3 months, that's a insane amount of data. So you really need to plan ahead of time and really have your plan in place, that this is the data you're going to collect, and this is how we're going to process it, and this is how we're going to analyze it. This is how we're going to retain it, because the FDA is going to want to see part of it once we submit our marketing application. I think all of the planning that goes into it up front will make your trial run that much more seamlessly. Another thing that I was going to mention is there's been a lot of talk about kind of the difference between the consumer versus medical grade, and kind of how do you share this information across different industries, platforms. The agency does have both a drug development tool program and a medical device development tool program, which is kind of our way of saying we understand that a third party is going to develop an app or a technology that can be used to collect this data for a specific patient population, and the tool development programs are our pathway to help you through that process, so that someone can come through and say, I've validated my smartwatch for steps in Parkinson's patients. And then many of the drug developers can then come through and use that technology that's already been validated and the agency has accepted. It's not a quick process. Both of those pathways are a little slow, but we're all learning together, and I think we're fully committed. And both programs do have pretty updated guidances to help with the development of those programs.
Great. So there's been some discussion on balancing the benefits of improving quality of life through new therapies that aren't necessarily providing a cure, with the kind of continued potentially the cost of those therapies or devices that can improve the quality of life, and potentially the downside of the increased financial burden for people who are using these more long-term drugs that could be costly. In the development process, how do we weigh those pros and cons?
Well, let me just say, I think some of our panelists have talked about this. Again, hearing from the patients what's important to them, and do understand that cost needs to be an issue. But frankly, I mean, you know, I can tell you from cancer patients, if they're in a lot of pain, they're not working. You know, and so, you know, if we hear from the patients what's going to help their quality of life, what's going to improve their quality of life, there may be ways where, you know, again, the endpoints that we might think as researchers are important might not be the ones that are as important to the individuals that we're trying to take care of, that we should be designing our clinical trials around. And so quality of life is critical. If arthritis patients, you know, if they're struggling with arthritic pain, they're not working. So I think these are things that we can take into consideration and really trying to identify ways to think about patient-reported outcomes in a different way. I think it's oftentimes an afterthought, but really I think within the design of of the clinical trials, it may actually make the clinical trials more efficient if the endpoint is around things that patients identify as important to them, that help to improve their quality of life, and that cost savings can certainly be factored in to the overall cost of development.
Right. And Karen, I was just going to say that was a great segue, if I could, into a question that was directed to you on commenting on the ARM program that you presented. And the question is, how can we best ensure patients' full representation and attend to those structural determinants of health, gender, race, social status, socioeconomic barriers, specifically when implementing a program such as you described with the ARM program, integrating patient voices in their participation at all levels?
Yeah, I mean, I think Grace hit the nail on the head when she talked about advocacy groups needing to make sure that they're inclusive. This is no different. This would be really the folks who are implementing this program need to be very intentional about who they're inviting. And so right now, again, we've piloted and really being thoughtful about who we're inviting to the table. And so I do think that this also could be leveraged just like anything else. Precision medicine can be leveraged in a way that can widen gaps. This ARM program can be implemented in a way that widens gaps. We want to make sure that you have inclusive participation, but that requires intentionality in terms of the types of individuals you are inviting to the table to participate. And so I do think that this is where those relationships, this has to be done at the institutional level. This has to be done, you know, at the drug developers. It has to be done at the cancer centers, with them saying, who are the partners that I have relationships with? And if you don't have relationships with partners, then it's time to start to develop them now so that you can really ensure inclusive participation in this sort of ARM program, which really can help to revolutionize the way that we think about and design clinical trials.
And we have another question that was directed at an example that Beth provided. The question is, in their experience, a pulmonary stress test can sometimes really push the patient to where he or she needs a medical provider with the BLS certification on standby. And the question is, can a 6-minute walk test be done at the patient's home without compromising the data or the results?
I think the jury's still out on that one. I think we all have hesitations about having a patient do a 6-minute walk test at home. But I think that's where we're hopeful that maybe there's a better test out there that we can, some endpoint that hasn't been developed yet that could be collected with a wearable. But no, I don't think anyone is comfortable having a patient do a 6-minute walk test at home by themselves right now.
So there was also discussion in the chat that you all might have seen on the topic regarding the separation between the digital health technologies as drug development tools versus digital health technologies as medical devices. And there is a question of whether or not you all can comment on the opportunity of developing open source algorithms for signal processing, such that this information can be harmonized across data sources to support development of disease progression models.
So I'm not a data expert, but I can think of an analogy that happened, 20 years ago or so in cancer with the International Genomics Consortium, where genomics tools were pretty new. And one of the issues that people had in collecting cancer samples and then interpreting the data was the fact that people were using different technologies for collection, storage, and processing of those samples, especially with gene expression, which can be highly context dependent. And so a consortium was put together to actually agree on how to collect these samples, how to manage them, interpret them, even the minute the physician was taking a biopsy. And I can imagine the same needs to be happening here. And again, I'm not the digital sort of data expert, but I think the principle is the same.
And so
yes, I think that's.
No, go ahead, Beth.
I think the agency's effort in that is the drug and medical device development tool programs. There are some other groups such as the Digital Medicine Society that I think can be great platforms to expedite the open source pathways.
So we're coming up on the end of our time, and I wanted to throw out one last question, kind of with the elephant in the room that we're all dealing with. And I know Jim, you and others talked about how COVID has changed the way we do things, and potentially it can change the way we do things in the future. And so I was wondering if you, Jim and others, or all of you, could maybe speak briefly on what are some of the changes that you have witnessed because of COVID that you think will be beneficial for us to hold on to in the future?
So it's a great question, and I think that probably if I were to say a definite benefit that I'd love to see in the future is enhanced collaboration around like a common enemy, right? And like imagine if we turned that common enemy into cardiovascular disease or obesity or diabetes or Alzheimer's, and just shared collaboration among sponsors, among the community, to work together to tackle some of these things. With respect to the actual operations, if you will, of how how clinical trial visits are being done or how data are being collected or whatnot, I think we're in the midst of a great experiment, frankly. I think that a lot of protocols have had to be modified on the fly using best available information to keep things running. And new protocols coming down have had to take some risks about how they're going to launch a new trial in this environment. And we're all going to learn from that. I mean, for most of those trials, FDA hasn't seen the data yet. Like we're hopeful that this is going to show us that, hey, you know what, you can do things in innovative ways and still get great answers to clinical questions. But exactly which of those modifications will be perceived as benefits, and we ought to consider them for the future, and which of them we might see as, gosh, this actually introduced a lot more variability into our trial than we anticipated. That might not be one that we want to carry forward if we have the option not to. I think we're going to learn from that. So in short, I love the collaboration. We all ought to learn from that. And then, on both sides, on industry sides, academia sides, and on the regulator side, I think we need to take an open mind as we look at the data that result from these trials and take lessons learned from it into the future.
Dr. Drake, I do think that this COVID has been great in terms of keeping the focus on patients too. What are the things that are making it easier? Can we do consents, remotely instead of having the patients always have to come to us? Or can they get a blood draw done closer to home if it's a standard blood draw, instead of having the patients have to drive, 2 hours to come to our center? And so again, for our patients who may have some geographic, issues, these are the things that are really matter. Can we do visits? Can we do virtual visits that will prevent a patient from having to incur that additional costs? And we know that there's some issues with respect to digital divide, but I do think that my hope is that people will start to think critically about what they're including in the trials Do we really need to have that additional CT scan? Do we really need to have that blood test drawn? You know, is this going to be beneficial to the patients? Can we ask the patients if this is going to add additional burden? So I do think that COVID has really helped to launch some new thoughts around how we can ensure that we are thinking about reducing patient burden in clinical trials.
That's exactly right. And I do think that as a company that's in the midst of developing a treatment for an acute episode where the point of the sites are at the ER. And so we had patients with AF who were then hesitant to go into the ER, whereas a hotbed of, COVID, it really highlighted the need to have a solution for the patients at home and finding that risk benefit to provide that solution. And it also highlighted the need to have these digital tools and be able to do remote screening and all these other things you mentioned. So I think that's going to be a silver lining, I think, if we can find ways to get comfortable with that for when it makes sense to treat patients at home, to have them treat themselves, even some issues that could be medically supervised treatment, but through telehealth if the patient has been carefully screened beforehand. So I do think that we need to be much more critical. I think we'll be able to have more access that way. And just one last comment of what COVID, just more in general, in addition to operationalization of clinical trials, is really, I hope we'll finally have a greater focus on really investing in infectious disease, which has been a huge, huge issue. And it's not, we don't typically talk about it as a chronic disease, but when we think about where we're going with pandemic and seasonal respiratory viruses, I know Howie's on the call. Howie Rosen and I worked on Tamiflu at Gilead. We worked with a relationship with Roche and really got immersed in the nature of what happens when you have a respiratory virus that can actually be quite serious and is not treated properly, or there's not enough investment in treatments. And so I think now what's been challenging is you have an ever-changing treatment paradigm and various variants. So that in the context of trying to develop not only new antivirals, new anticoagulopathy or anti-inflammatories, it's going to be challenging, but we must make those investments and we must think about this as a problem that's not going to go away. Not only will coronavirus likely become endemic, we'll have continued variants, we may have new influenza pandemics. And so thinking about broader solutions, broad spectrum antivirals, broad spectrum vaccines, these are things that we must invest in. Because guess what? As we were saying earlier, these populations we've been talking about today with chronic disease are disproportionately affected, particularly disenfranchised populations. So as part of the solution, we must take the opportunity to see what we've learned from this past year and apply it in future investment in a new way for these conditions.
And the only thing that what I would add is that the lesson learned from COVID and why we have vaccines within a year is collaboration. And so it's just collaborate. And I can say across the industry with colleagues at different companies, we're on the phone with each other. If we have a tool that would help the vaccine manufacturers, we give it to them. If they have a question and they're a smaller company and they need to know how do you process this, that, and the other thing, we help. We get on the phone at the drop of the hat. And I think that that's this new norm that we can do that for other diseases and not just COVID. And then the other thing I would say is that there are many things that we have implemented, like remote inspections, where inspectors are getting a tour of a manufacturing plant because an individual has a camera on their head, and we're having meetings, of course, like this one, where we would be in person perhaps, but we're doing it virtually and we're reaching more. And quite honestly, not only has COVID given us a hard-learned lesson around collaboration, it's given us a way into the future that's a much more sustainable for all of the horrors of COVID and all of the suffering of COVID. It's taught us that there's a more sustainable way to work and live. And I think that it's incumbent on us to incorporate that new sustainable way. And I'm talking about climate change here, and possibly not all of us flying around as much as we did before, but we can do this differently. Our whole ecosystem can adjust there never will be a post-COVID world, to Grace's point, but there will be a new normal. And I think the minute that we start to be able to have herd immunity, we'll have to all resist the temptation to go back to the way that it was before, whether it's in the clinical trials or the regulatory review or healthcare itself. We're going to have to hold firm that some of these things should never go back to the fully in-person way that we used to work. And that's just the right thing to do.
I'll just echo what everyone else has said of the collaboration and the emphasis on the patient and really the creativity of how we have adapted our ways. And I'm excited that I do think, as Michelle said, these will be the new norms.
Dr. Shakar, I know we are at time, but I'm hoping we could squeeze out just a couple more minutes. There was one more question from an attendee, specifically about this collaboration during COVID. They say everyone talks about collaboration, its benefits, and the need for it. But however, despite increased collaboration during COVID, if we had much better collaboration at the beginning, chaos would have been decreased. So there is a need for mechanisms to make sure that these collaborations happen. And so what kind of systems approach be beneficial so that in the future, we can have these types of collaborations from the very beginning? And if so, who builds it? It's a great question. I don't know if anyone wants to attempt to kind of give your thoughts. I mean,
be the new scientific advisor at the White House.
Yeah, I think we do need, I don't know how, that's part of the challenge is who starts it and how do you get momentum. I think a forum like this is a great idea because now we've connected with a lot of different stakeholders across the system. And I do think that we need to think of broad consortia to actually address this in the manner of other consortia that have been successful, where you have public, private, nonprofit, and governmental entities who are working together and actually spending resources, bringing the right people together. And then you have to think about things that you can pilot to have small wins early on. So can you take a couple of examples and show that a new model can work? End to end, easier said than done. But I do think that we need to be able to define what success looks like and get stakeholders, and even within the healthcare system, public, private companies, every piece of the way, providers, developers, payers, everybody needs to come together, and obviously regulators from the government side.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting and important question, but part of the challenge with this pandemic is that it became so highly politicized. And I don't know who's responsible for kind of putting stops in place to make, keep that from happening. Right? This is about people's lives. We're over, you have 500,000 people who are dead, many of whom didn't need to die. That's a problem. And you would think that it would be something that our government would be able to tackle, but we all understand that this is much broader in terms of stakeholders. And so I do hope that we can be collaborative. We see how divided our nation is still and to this day. And so I think that's a very interesting, but it's a tough conversation. I think ultimately, since we are all taxpayers, well, most of us are, that it really should kind of land in, the government should be there for everybody, and I think that's been the challenge that we've seen over the past year, is that unfortunately that wasn't the case. And I think that it starts with kind of having that unified message in the government that says we are here to serve the people. And then everything else can fall in line because they can be the conveners of people, if you will.
And what I would add is that I think that the world got a good fast education on how, well, we're highly advanced and can bring forward a cell-based therapeutic quickly, or an mRNA therapeutic quite quickly. That's like the height of sophistication to be able to scale the way that we have. We have not invested in the infrastructure for healthcare delivery. And where our doctors and nurses live, they may use sophisticated tools, but they're still using antiquated technology and records and supply chains. And it's because we haven't invested either in healthcare or in schools and infrastructure. And you see the consequences of it in terms of being able to move quickly. No matter the sophisticated solution, we're still dealing with antiquated systems, and we need more investment in healthcare infrastructure to modernize it, to be able to do what we know can be done, but we simply don't have the systems or the infrastructure to bring those solutions forward as quickly as needed to happen with COVID. And that's aside from the governmental issues that were touched on before.
Great. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. This was a great discussion, and it's very encouraging to hear so many of us working from different perspectives, but all with a common goal of tackling these prevalent chronic conditions and making it equitable across all of our population. So I am going to turn it back over to Dr. Shakar.